Okay. I'm just going to say a quick thank you for coming on our hottest day of the year. You've chosen to sit inside the gallery with us, which is fantastic. Really delighted to have two highly esteemed artists, academics with us. Jane Mooney, who's written our catalogue essay, is here, and also Kenneth Dingwall, who's a painter but also was a very good friend of Jon Schueler. So it's going to be a discussion event, and people can maybe ask questions at the end or as we go. Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy as we go.
Surely, yes.
Just the quick context of this exhibition. It's the centenary year of Jon Schueler's birth. So this is part of a national celebration happening across Scotland with exhibitions in Stirling. This exhibition we're touring across the Highlands, so it goes to Thurso and to Kingussie, and also exhibitions happening in New York as well, and elsewhere in the US, isn't it?
Yes.
So just to say that's the sort of tour, and we've got the catalogue for sale. That's stickers. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris.
That's okay.
Well, we thought we would just introduce ourselves a little bit. I studied at Edinburgh College of Art and the Royal College of London. Then I was very fortunate enough to have 2 years studying in Rome as a Roman scholar there. And then came back to teach at the Royal College of Art. And I currently have visiting professorships at Grays in Aberdeen and Birmingham, so Birmingham City University. I really was largely unfamiliar with Jon Schueler's work, so you have a real contrast here. Somebody who knows his work extremely well and knew Jon very well. I never met Jon, and in some ways that allowed me to be very unencumbered by anything he said and just to, interpret the work for the catalogue essay. But having been aware of always somehow I was aware of Jon Schueler on somewhere on the horizon of Scottish artists working in Scotland, and largely through Ken and Eve Thompson, who's here, who are great friends and mutual friends. So I have had that awareness without really knowing him or his work in any depth. So for me, it's been a great opportunity to explore that work through writing the catalogue essay. And then we've had a few conversations recently about Jon's work, and we'd like to maybe rehearse, not rehearse, but discuss. So to expand those discussions a bit in this forum.
I'm Ken Dingwall, I'm a painter. I too trained at Edinburgh College of Art, and then in the Athens School of Art in Greece, and lived there for a couple of years, teaching English to Greek army officers and painting in the islands. I then came back and I taught at the Edinburgh College of Art for some time, and then I taught for about 20 years in the States in various places, at Yale, at Minneapolis, and Cleveland. My paintings are in public collections like Gallery of Modern Art, Museum, and various museums of the city. I met all the country. I met Jon maybe 2 or 3 days after he came back to Scotland for the second time in 1970. We met in a bar at the Tribex Theatre, and we talked to a closing time. I was saying this in a talk on Sky, and I was saying the thing that one of the most amazing things for me was listening to somebody talking so wittily and so eloquently, and he'd given up the drink by that time. Whereas in the Scotland of my era, alcohol was the main lubricant of conversation. But from then on, right through to Jon's death, we were in lost contact in Scotland or in the States. And I thought that whilst you have, the possibility of picking up a catalogue, a very excellent catalogue, I do recommend, beautifully designed, great range of images, and interesting text, really fascinating. Buy this book. But in it, there's a little biography, but I thought I don't want to spend a lot of time on a biography because we want to talk about the paintings. But it says, for example, that John took a BA and an MA at the University of Wisconsin. He took a BA in economics because his dad wanted him to go into the firm that he had, and then John rebelled and took an MA in English literature. And when he finished that, he more or less went straight away into the US Air Force as a volunteer. And I remember him telling me that on the very first day that he arrived for training, they saw two planes collide in the sky and they were being wiped out. It was a sort of forewarning of what was to come. And I remember John telling me his very first sight of Scotland, and I think it's interesting in the sense that here we are celebrating an American painter who came to Scotland, the why of coming to Scotland. And the very first why was that he said, he flew across the Atlantic as a navigator in the B-17 bomber, and they had hardly any training at all. And so, as a navigator, he was just petrified. And so suddenly, out of nowhere, appears Scotland and the Western Isles. And he flies down there, and he stops at Prestwick to refuel and down. So, being in the States, I can't tell you how many times parties and dinner parties and so on, people would come and say, of John's generation, and walk up and say, I hear you're Scottish. And, first time I saw Scotland was, I sailed into Greenock. So I was in an American troop carrier, and we were so goddamn relieved we were alive, and then we went somewhere so beautiful. And they had all gone back. Like John came back. And I think John came back partially because he had an extraordinary career in the States, in the sense that when he survived the war, I mean, one of the things that was astonishing about being in the American Air Force was that they flew in the daytime and they were sitting targets, and they were wiped out by the droves. And so he very quickly became the last surviving member of all of the crew who had been brought in from the States. And inevitably, as John did, took its toll, and he had fatigue, wartime fatigue. He was invalided at home, spent time in hospitals and so on. And at the end of that, started to write. His career as a writer. He taught English literature at the University of San Francisco, and then suddenly by chance went to a portrait painting class. And suddenly something clicked, a bug went to it, and he was able to use his GI Bill monies to attend the San Francisco Institute of Art, which was like any other art school. I gave a training in point of reference painting, working from the model and so on. But in the final years, it suddenly had gathered together an extraordinary faculty, a faculty now that are in sort of art history groups. So Clifford Still was his tutor, that Mark Roscoe was his tutor of summer courses, Ad Reinhardt was the tutor there. And from there, Clifford Still responded to John's work and suggested that he should come to New York. And so here's this guy, matured in the sense that he endured, survived the war, but he's just fresh out of art school, art student. And suddenly he's being introduced by Clifford Still into this extraordinary league of people in the history groups. Franz Klein, something just impressed him gigantically. And so, inevitably, in a situation like that, here he is, just starting out, and there are these men who are all in their 40s, late 40s, into their 50s. People like Barnett Newman found Johnny's first studio and so on. He slept in Ad Reinhardt's old bed. And there is this sense that, amongst all these guys that are talking and drinking and so on. And in an odd way, all of that generation had fought against a kind of narrative, figurative painting, a kind of schmaltzy imagery, and felt that you could create out of abstraction and out of surrealism a new language, a language where the mind could convey, as we see even downstairs in the museum, human beings since ever have been making images from forms and shapes that seem to have had meaning for human beings. And at the same time, they were tapping into the kind of surrealist language which was picking up on Freud and Jung, that we carry ideas and identities in our subconscious mind as well as our conscious mind. So abstract expression is a sort of meld of this. And so John, in trying to think, who am I in here, almost turned back. I mean, it's interesting that he and the contemporary painter, someone like John Mitchell, both of them decided that they could allow nature to be part of the starting point of the subconscious dialogue. And so, in a way, when John was over here in Britain, one of the reasons he thought about Scotland was that first experience of seeing it. It was also he had a girlfriend who had spent a lot of time on Argyll and on Arran. And in his mind's eye, I suppose, in that sort of thought, you know, you get up every morning and you're going to go to bed again at night, you're to be alive the next day, Scotland became a kind of Shangri-La in his mind. And so when in New York he had achieved some success with showing very good galleries, a stable gallery, and showing the Stelly gallery, he finally got enough money to come back to Scotland. He flew over and came and searched around and couldn't really find the studio space in 1957, but he spent 6 months in Scotland and vowed that that was someplace he was going to come back, that there was some kind of charge he felt that he was getting as an emotional energy to make up from being in this environment. And so when I met him in 1970, he had worked various jobs, achieved a certain amount of money, had taken a sabbatical from being director of the art school at the University of Illinois, and had just decided that he was going to cut from New York. The kind of art world was there, the kind of cutthroat activity was there, and he was just going to drive around to Scotland till he found the place in his mind that he was looking for, and that turned out to be Malay. And this painting here is the very first painting he made when he came back to Scotland in Malay. And what you have to have in your mind, and we start from the show, is that person who came over here was a full-blooded abstract expressionist painter. He had undercurrents of Clifford Still in his mind. Still introduced him to Turner, and that sort of kicked into his mind of the idea of a nature as a vehicle, a carrier, a stimulus. But he was still painting paintings that were very, very much of a subconscious reaction to the gesture you put on the canvas. It tells you the next move. There's a piece of film, I think, we're going to be shown sometime in court of a conversation John and I had after he did an exhibition at the Talbot Rice Gallery, where he painted in the gallery in front of an audience. He said it was the nearest thing he had to being back playing jazz, that he was improvising in front of an audience. And I think that what we thought in this conversation would be that I would shut up and that we would begin from that point of John arriving here as a card-carrying abstract expressionist painter, and how he still felt always, and I would regularly talk to him in the studio and say, "Are you still an abstract painter? What about these guys?" And so I think that might be the place that we would come in from.
Yeah, because I think we probably, you having had the benefit of those conversations with Schueler, you can be quite affirmative about the fact that he always maintained he was an abstract painter. I think the paintings tell a different kind of story to a degree. And it very much is the question, I think the interesting question that we have touched upon, you know, in passing really, that we've never quite talked through, is the degree to which they are abstract. What kind of abstraction is it? Or maybe what, for me, one of the interesting things that really just came up when we were looking around the show last night was what kind of space does the sky offer Schueler? So for me, clearly nature, there's a great indebtedness there. And I suppose I called my catalogue essay Sounding and Responding because I certainly felt that he takes soundings from nature and then responds to those kind of soundings, those recordings, if you like. That nature is a kind of generative impetus for the work, but the work goes on to do, you know, other things. But last night I was thinking about where there was that point of figuration where he was painting ostensible skies with nude female figures embedded in these skies. There was the declared intention to push the woman back into the sky in order to rid the work of figuration. So that then raises the question, if pushing the woman into the sky is getting rid of figuration, what is the sky for him? You know, and for me it seems to be a space of possibility, a space of repository for all sorts of, because we've talked, you talked more about this relationship with his mother in relation to the sky. But for me it became like they become like an incoherent space, a space of possibility and undifferentiation. So nothing it's a space of possibility, like Kristeva's idea of the chorus, you know, where it's a place from which things issue. It's a creative set of possibilities that are offered, but also that things can disappear again into an undifferentiated nothingness, because I think the nothingness that he responds to, that he addresses through these works, is again really critical, both in terms of, I think, painting, but also in terms of a life. You know, what is it that he is confronting when he is confronting that nothingness, if you like?
Yes, I think the context of the woman in the sky, it was a kind of vehicle that his painting carried this thought, was something that came to him, I say, during his flying experience, where I suppose almost in a kind of, you know, either in a kind of dream or fear, he started to think about the fact that his mother died soon after his birth, and that in that sense of kind of praying he'll get through another day, he's thought often about his mother, the sky. And I think that almost when I don't think that's a theme that he dealt with in writing, but it is something that when he started to paint, and he actually has a notation in his journals of missing an appointment one day and coming back to the studio and realizing it was Mother's Day. And so he thought, God, I've got the whole day I can work, and made this painting. And at the end of it, he felt that somehow or other, that confluence of it being Mother's Day and him thinking about his mother, and that the marks that he was making on the canvas pulled out something in his head that he felt was his mother in the sky, the echo of that kind of sensation that started in the water. And I think that, one of the things that Jon talked about, he was talking about nature, but for him nature wasn't painting skies. Nature was painting life, birth, life, and death. There's a comment he made when he was friends with Ed Reinhardt when they were in the studio together, and Ed Reinhardt was saying, I think, our work looks tremendously different, but there are things in common. And John said, yeah, death. But Reinhardt didn't pick up that bit.
It was Reinhardt that had said that's what we have in common. That we're both
no, John said.
Oh, was that right? I thought it come the other way.
But I do think that that idea of an emotional wavelength is what John plays with the sky. This, I think, is all of us. You pull the curtain in the morning and it's dreary as hell outside. You're not exactly related. You open it and the sky is blue and you have a different emotional sensation. That's a tremendously banal opposition. That, people that we are intimate and friendly with, we know their moods from just a pull of their face, from how their bodies can help. We read all sorts of visual signals, and I think that John was using that sense of reception of colour, so that if he makes little monochrome paintings like this, you could say, oh yes, that was a kind of evening light, the sky is coming down. But in a kind of way, they're just like little mood poems, where he's accepting that if I put a little cadmium red and just a tiny bit of Payne's grey into it, it's a sort of sad, cold grey, isn't it? So, let's put a bit more cadmium red deep in it, and it sweetens that way. And so he's playing with that kind of nuance of the tuning of colour relationships. And in a way, he's painting really always in that sky. I mean, in the end, what he's painting there is the beginnings of modernism. It's the beginnings of a shallow pictorial field that he's playing back and forward within. And he tells stories and tunes in them. But I know that when I would be talking to John, there's never ever a discussion of its narrative or emotive content. Certainly in the movie that we made at the Talbot Rice Gallery, it's entirely about what you say. This is us playing back the film of him painting, and we're talking about it. And I'm saying, well, I noticed you put that big blob of red on the bottom there. He said, oh yes, I put that. And I knew that I had to counterbalance it with this up here on the right. And then when I put that in, I thought, that's not really, it's not. So I do this over there. And then when I did that, I'd gone too far. So I had to be taken out and moved back. And, in a way, I was talking to a poet, Thomas Clark, quite recently, and he was talking about the sense that his poetry is about the landscape. About emotions and moods he feels in the landscape. And I said, and when you're sitting there writing, are you writing about a memory of an afternoon somewhere up the dial? And he said, no. What I'm doing is I'm reading back the words and I'm thinking, that's too heavy a word. That needs another syllable out of it. That really crunches. And to make more breath.
I don't think any of that precludes them being read as landscapes, or at least as being indebted to the landscape. Because I think all of that, even in the most narrative of works, artists that we both would love, Titian, for example, all of those considerations are in there as well as everything else. So it's not a kind of I think,
but just because you're doing Titian, I remember seeing a large Titian show at the National Gallery in Washington, and incredible. And what I had at that moment was an understanding. It was a very fascinating catalogue, which was describing the fact that Titian had no Latin. That Titian got things which were the equivalent of comic papers in street town. And so when we read into his great understanding and empathy with the philosophical position of a classical myth that he's responding to, he's taking it from comic cuts. And what he's bringing to that is that superficial understanding of it, and he's also bringing a reaction to the damn stuff that he's putting on the canvas. And the sense that I will do something in a very focused way up here, and I'm just going to put a wash down the bottom here, that will let topsy paint dribble down this surface here. That's that interplay that I'm saying, that I think that the poet has, that obviously he's conveying something, but it's the process of conveying it that makes it happen.
Yeah. So you would...
Well, it's just when you're talking about abstraction and landscape, and somebody asked me such an obvious question the other day that took me by surprise. And I thought, well, all those of us who were lucky enough to meet Jon know the answer or read about it. But they just asked, did he actually paint from the landscape? Did he go outside and paint? And he never, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, and never worked from working on. He lots of landscape drawing and never worked from
so
drawing.
he never actually had an image of a landscape or a view in his head. So that's a sort of beginning of abstraction. And for me, these paintings give me the most emotional response I probably get from many artists in the world. But when I was lucky enough to stay there, it was such an intellectual process. So then it's that sort of bringing the two of those together, I suppose, that makes it very powerful work for me.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, I agree. You see, I think of those, the woman in the sky painting, where there's very explicit figuration. And it's, a female nude with her legs split. And they bring to mind so strongly Courbet's Origin of the World, which is really just an incredibly realist focus on a woman's pudenda genitalia. And interestingly, that painting was owned by Jacques Lacan, who was the biggest, the most important post-Freudian psychoanalytic theorist. I mean, immensely influential at the moment in terms of thinking about not only psychoanalysis, but about thinking about art. And, that's just interesting, I think, that little kind of connection. But there is in that focus, it's about a kind of life and death, so there is this sense of, and that's why I think it's important when you talk about his mother as also being that woman in the sky, that there is that sense of, again, that's why I think of it kind of as a coda, or a kind of cauldron, where these energies are being generated so that there is both life and then a decay into something else. It's that quite a cyclical thing. I still, although they're not in any way mimetic, it's interesting the degree to which, and you look at the titles that he gave many of the works as well, if he is wanting to assert, the primacy of abstract painting as opposed to anything else, there is also something else that is slightly contradictory, but I think in an interesting way. Yeah. Through the titles, it would lead us to, a title only ever serves to lead you or point you in a certain direction. And he points in these, but for me it's very much about finding painterly equivalents to those energies that he experienced in the landscape. And I think it's the experience that is much more important than, let's say, notation. It's because it's about experience, it's about bringing the intellectual and the emotional into, this kind of very productive relationship. And sometimes an abrasive relationship.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's also a certain degree of gamesmanship in it too, in the sense I'm saying that Jon was deliberately, and like John Mitchell, taking the idea that nature had a place in making abstract painting. And that certainly didn't win him points in New York abstract world. And then by the time he was coming in the 70s, that was being usurped by pop art. And so, in a way, John, when he was putting out these titles, was in a way countering and showing his space, as opposed to, say, his mentor, Clifford Still, who made paintings entirely with letters and numbers as titles, and he didn't want anything to intrude in the reading back that would come from the image on the surface. That was his intent. Whereas I think John, in so signaling, deciding that he would give them space. I mean, some of these paintings that he made in the early 50s, the first time, he made them in New York about Scotland, and then changed the titles to quite specific place names when he got back and exhibited them in New York.
Do you know why he did that? Why?
Well, I think he saw it very much as a stance that nature had a place.
Yes.
And that
it was just asserting that.
Yes. I mean, when you think about the beginning places for many of that abstract expressionist generation, I mean, the classical myth was one of the areas.
Yes.
And in that era, in the States, people like Robert Motherwell and Clifford Still for a spell were involved in trying to set up an art school which would contravene the kind of normal art school experience of working from a point of reference. And the title of the art school was to be The Subjects of the Artists, stating that you weren't just banging bits of paint on, that there was some emotional, intellectual, conceptual idea that you felt could be conveyed in the same way that I was going back to the pictorial space as a 19th century space. In a way, that was also the kind of emotional drive of 19th century painting, that painting could have the same power as music without imitating. But just as music could touch you, an inner place in you could suddenly pull tears to your eyes and make you elated, that their platform was that just by placements of colours on surfaces, you had a vehicle that could do the same kinds of things. And so, in a way, John, coming in at the tail end of that, trying to find a new space, was trying to make a place for that sense that nature could be one of the stimuli that provoked nature.
Well, the notion of the abstract of life is really quite critical in relation to Rothko and Clifford Still and people that he was, his mentors and people that he was close to. And there is something. Now, in Clifford Still, any kind of residual reference to, fractured cliff faces or whatever it might have been that acted as a stimulus to the work are kind of, they're left behind. They've been maybe deployed and served their purpose, and then they're gone. With Schueler, that kind of, because I do experience that sense of the sublime in relation to some of these works, which is really about a kind of experience of awe and being overawed, but actually the pleasure comes from recognizing that you can cope with this. It's not actually overwhelming to the extent that you as a subject are sort of dissipated or erased or effaced. So the pleasure comes in that terror, the potential terror that you overcome. And there is something, I think, in these paintings that operates in that way as a kind of abstract of mind. But I still think there is a residual reference. I don't know you want to say. Yeah, only a reference to the landscape. And I don't have any problem doesn't impede, all the other ways in which the works operate. But I don't know if you see that or
Oh, I do.
You do.
I mean, if you've sold out, changed your life, and moved out of New York, you've elected to come to Scotland, you've elected to come to the west coast of Scotland, you've come there because it gives you something. And if you're working away there, you're extracting something from it. But I mean, I would say, at a very mundane level, this painting behind was John coming to the lake at the end of a relationship, at the end of a point where he felt that the New York art world wasn't about the kind of values he was interested in anymore. And coming, and you can say, well, it was a bad day in the lake. But I think if you were walking around this gallery and you were looking at the catalogue and the chronology of it, you would see that the palette that John's using just gradually goes on and on and on. Gets more intense. And you could put that down simply that maybe he was in a good phase in his life, that he was in a good relationship, that he was enjoying not having to bugger off out of the studio to do teaching commitments. I've got a bit of correspondence with him talking about things like a traveling sales, commuting down to Maryland Institute, at the University of Pennsylvania, I found out in Parliament, but he was on the train as much of the time as he was in the studio. And suddenly he made this incredible break. He took a job for a couple of years running this monster State University Fine Art Department and just cut it out completely. Cleverly managed to get himself a sabbatical year and tried to get himself a second sabbatical year after that. But he did that with the intent of giving himself a little cushion that he could buy time to paint all the time. And I think definitely, having spent that emotional energy coming here, financial energy coming here, he was responding to what he was in. But I think, as Sue's saying, never once was he putting a canvas up out in the landscape.
No.
Never once did he have working drawings that he pinned up on the wall and said, I'm going to use that as a point of reference. And so I think that as he saw things, he carried them. I'm sure he carried ideas of pictures of light, of positions of shapes. And I think there are times in the there are paintings where he carried echoes of other painters. And John talked about that as an influence on. I think that there are points where he's painting The Sound of Sleep where you see very strong echoes of that kind of compositional placement of one kind of horizontal block against a smaller, thinner one. But I think often in the paintings, as he made marks on the canvas and tuned away at what it was talking back to him about, there would be ghost images come out of them. You could walk around and see, there's rum sitting out in a mist in the sea and so on. But I don't think that's what he was aiming at. I think that was just, as you pull out words, you're writing something, you put down a word, and that first word sometimes works beautifully, then you put out another variant on it, another variant, and you're tuning away. You don't really know what you're trying to say. But you are conscious that that word's not got the funny kind of associational baggage that that word has. And so you remove it and you place another in. And in that same way in a painting, I think John played those games, and because he was there, because he wanted to respond to nature, I think he accepted sometimes these ghost images in the paintings. And I think as we can't see that from this body of work, which represents one time phase, but when John moved back to New York, though he was regularly coming back and painting on the west coast of Scotland, he started to be able to paint on scale. His Malay studio never allowed him to. And these were big canvases in the Malay studio. And this was an old schoolroom, really, that he had. And so he suddenly had a loft, an old factory, a warehouse factory, that he had as a studio. that people were getting, I mean, I think when John moved into it was the first time he had enough money because he had a number of sales through having a really good dealer at that point. And so he's somebody who's able to put down money for estates. And it was very little money because all of these warehouses were lying empty. Nobody wanted them. And so artists got into it. But John decided he was going to be in this for the long haul, and so he was the only artist in that building that went legit, that he actually paid for the electricity, that he actually plumbed into the water supply and paid for it, as opposed to the other people in the area getting to that loft. The extraordinary thing is that loft, as with so many of the lofts in those kind of areas nowadays, millions and millions that artists no longer live in them, that there are all sort of money people who live in them. The artists moved out, usually up to New York State, where they bought old derelict farms for a song, and they'll not be what the thoughts. But I'm just saying that in that sense, when John moved to this vast space, suddenly started to make enormous canvases. And in those canvases, the memory, that sub-memory, that we can read and say, oh yeah, that looks like a bit of a coastline, that's a mist hanging along the bottom of the hills at the edge of the sea and so on. That wasn't so close in his mind. And so what he was playing was with all that kind of crude information in his mind. But on this new scale, he really was moving about in the landscape of the canvas. And I would say that that body of paintings, these very large-scale paintings, have less of that kind of after-image reading. And yet, they're about the same damn thing.
Yeah, well, that's the critical thing. It's like where the paintings take us, what they stimulate in terms of, when we ponder them. And it's never wrong. Yeah, I mean, people are welcome to respond to what as they see fit. If they want to see it simply as a landscape that's pleasant, and it's fine, but I think those kind of references to a rising line on the edge of a coastline or whatever, or a particular kind of cloud formation, they're kind of there and they're not that important. I think that's what I want to see. It's what that allows the painting to do in terms of what it allowed Schueler to do in terms of those kind of meditations on the big themes, which really are life and death, existence. It's very difficult to talk about that, except that the works talk about it quite eloquently. And one of the things that troubled me when I was reading a wee bit of John's biography as I was writing the catalogue essay was a kind of, there's something that was very much to do with the time, about the way he talked about other women painters, kind of key painters in New York at the time who were really having to struggle to make that, because I'm looking at mostly it's women in the not Susan, but the kind of extra efforts they had to make to be noticed. And when he referred to Grace Artigan and what's her name? John Mitchell, and then Franklin Taylor as the three musketeers, wandering around New York, sort of kicking ass and things. They kind of necessarily, I think, had to be like that. And it's a kind of interesting, because at various points I found the language kind of made you draw short. It's kind of, when he talks about Eleanor Ward, who he felt really in many ways betrayed him. And he says very clearly, she's a bitch. And then in the next sentence he said, but I still like her, and she's still a friend, and I, kind of pick. And she was somebody who did that very switch from supporting his work and other abstract expressionists to then going to Warhol and the pop artists. even although she apparently didn't particularly respond to the work, but it was a kind of business decision. And so there's something that really brings that era into an interesting, sharp focus.
But I suppose one of the things, if you haven't read, I think it's a couple of you should read The Sound of Sleep. I mean, it's an artist's journal. And John, everywhere John moved, he had these boxes and boxes of manuscripts, and regularly he would take spells of time off and try to knock them into shape. But he never really achieved that in his lifetime, so it's his widow and a friend who edited it, and they did a marvellous job. But what they were editing was John's language, and I suppose in a kind of way that relates to his painting. What he did was leave down on the page very honest thoughts, like she's a bitch, or stupid things that he was doing, messing up his life, lousy relationships he got into, or kind of awful feelings he had about his relationship with his stepmother, who up into adolescence, I think, never confessed that she wasn't his birth mother. So, and he leaves all these raw things out. And so it kind of, when I start trying to equate things that this is as good as, but just as Van Gogh's journals are about spilling out emotion that's driving the force of painting, I think that Magda and Diane did a fantastic job in just editing, giving it a shape, giving it a rhythm, giving it a form that does give you an insight to how somebody thought about painting at that time. And, one of the things is, we're constantly in the present. We feel we are in the present of constantly changing time. Modernity is past, we're in this new era, and yet that's how it's been since ever. That any block of painting, if you were to be walking around the National Gallery in Edinburgh, you would see blocks of time of men and women making paintings in their time, and we thought of as progressive in their time, and yet their progression really could very rarely be more than 10 or 20 years out of the caves of the kind of values that people had. I mean, I find that, say, if I'm saying I've got nothing to read, and I pick up a novel that I read when I was in my 20s, and I suddenly realize, gosh, that's a tongue language. It's not just a tongue. How you convey that thought is in a tongue language. And I think that John, all painters have that this is a language of a tongue. But John always wanted the emotions to be timeless, that they were about the large emotions that people were dealing with down in the Paleolithic period, that people ached and loved and whatever, and that's what John felt he was painting.
I ordinarily have almost no interest, I don't know why it is, in artists' biographies. I'm never that. I'm interested in the work, not particularly, but I think it's an extraordinarily candid account of an artist's life, and it really is the life and the work kind of brought into, this kind of relationship. And for anybody who's interested in Schueler, I would really recommend it, because I think it is, it's up there with some of the very best of the artist biographies. It really is quite an extraordinary achievement. I do think that Margaret and Diana did a fantastic editorial job on the thing. I'm just wondering if people have questions or comments or points they'd like to make.
All the times when we were speaking, you thought, gosh, if you could remember that question.
Just to follow on from what you're saying, I also think that for being half an hour, I can watch that again and again.
Yes.
And it says so much, it explains so much. I'm watching him work, he washes his brush on the palette,
Yeah.
watching where he stands, and when he sits,
Yes.
sits really intensely, staring at a blank canvas almost for ages, and then goes into action.
I agree. I've only seen it once at the San Moroste, and I was really taken with it, particularly hearing his voice, because having read, the biography, or chunks of the biography, I wasn't sure what I would have made of this person until I heard the voice, and I immediately warmed to him. I mean, I warmed to the work and things, but there were other elements that were just sort of, there were question marks.
I should say, the film was on 6:30 this evening.
I know,
It's
yes.
released, and it's on again next Wednesday.
Yes,
Just checking
that's
for
right.
myself.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's a list at the door as you come in of when it's being screened.
It's good.
But it's very, and it is one of those, it's very revelatory, especially when you're seeing even just the brushmark. You get a very keen sense of how he made some of these works and some of the edges, because of the kinds of brushes that he used and things like that. But both, I think, that documentary and are immensely revelatory and insightful. But I'm sure you have points to make or questions, do you not?
I was interested to hear, so John's come to painting quite late through literature. Because I think technically as freehand, he's a wonderful painter. So that stuck in my mind, but we haven't really done much until she was speaking.
I suppose one of the things that came out of that kind of teaching that he had in San Francisco was one of the teachers he had was Richard Diebenkorn, and there was David Parr. These are both very Diebenkorn moves back and forth in figuration and abstraction. David Parr was painting as an abstract painter and then became a very matter-of-fact figurative painter. So he had that beginning, but in the final stages of the course, they were encouraged to just paint millions of things. They painted on any kind of surface, they used any kind of rubbishy paint. And, for example, someone like Franz Klein had a terrible time because he got so accustomed to painting fast with rubbish paint that his rubbish black enamel started to crack and come away when he was a bit naked. A major problem. But for John, I mean, one of the things is, then in fact I met him in the bar, and the next morning he came out to my street and I went to his, and he'd been there for 3 or 4 days, and he had 20-odd paintings. I don't like it that really. And, he's got an extraordinarily prolific output. That doesn't mean that the paintings are painted. There are paintings that have time dates that run from 3 or 4 or 5 years working on them as well. But I think that at that beginning stage, he just literally made so much. He was working so much, teasing out how it feels, how it works, how to play with it. And one of the things when we met, I'd just been in London with a teaching job at Edinburgh University, teaching technical methods to art history students. And so I had about a week ahead of it. Profound knowledge about one fresco and the painting. But one of the things that John was desperately interested in was the good painting process. That was partially because that generation that he had met, people like Mark Rothko, had these terrible problems with using new colours, naphtha reds, which faded and did awkward things. The bad cases of pictures cracking badly, not being dried out. And John was very, very keen to use the best kind of materials that were forward. I can remember having an absolute panic attacks. At one point I was being up in LA and he had a whole series of canvases that suddenly had crazy paving cracking across them. And it turned out, he kept going over and over. And it turned out what he'd done was he'd mixed up a glue size that was too strong. And so when he was tapping across the surface of the canvas, he didn't see that it was so brittle that it was cracking. But by the time he put a thin paint veil on it, and it dried out, suddenly the cracks appeared. But it took ages to work that out. Of course, he destroyed every one of them. But in a sense, we're saying it's all this emotive outpouring, it's just splashing paint. Not at all. It's very constructive, caring, considerate painting. And I think one of the things that, maybe the documentary that and Jim saying, one's not interested in the biography of it. And I find myself often reading biographies and thinking, Caravan, I like to know that. But one of the things that we're dealing with these sort of grand emotional ideas that John was looking at. John could be talking about those, and just as fast as anything, he'd pull in some sort of wisecrack, he'd cut his feet away from under him with jokes about himself. He was immensely witty. That, unfortunately, you don't see it. Though I think maybe, sometimes these plays of how little will I put in this picture, and it still holds together, it's still believable. Where does the tension stop? I mean, in any painting, I think I'm incredible things. When the hell does it stop? Maybe there are points in painting you've just laid it in and you think, doesn't wreck it, and then you work some more, and you suddenly realise it's terribly unnecessary. And you keep working at it. And then I eat the skin of it. Colour that. Nails, because I suddenly think, so big something. And then suddenly you realise, it's gone. It's gone. You've got to scrap it, paint over it. What do you do? I think that's part of John's output, a bit like the journal, but I think he was brave enough to leave works, often in stages, hanging on a tension. Just as he was willing to leave things in his journals where he's saying, I'm an ass, done something stupid. And I think that's a very brave act. How do you move forward if you don't risk it?
I thought it was also quite poignant at the Schueler Symposium, listening to the local fishermen in Germany and how they'd all wondered who this madman was initially, and then absolutely come to understand exactly the painting and what his vision was, and taken ownership of it. And some of them having those wonderful shoes on their walls. Which at first they thought, it's quite nice, but actually have come to just even more and more to them. And talking about going out fishing that day and saying that's a shoeless guy today.
Yes.
And I think, that because John loved to talk, John loved it. But he would put on shows in the village hall, and people would come in to see what this daft American was doing. He would talk about them, saying, there are days you obviously read the sky, you're living is reading the sky, and try and find that middle ground as to what he was doing and what they were doing. That all of them, without any aesthetic training, had a language of pleasure, of colours, kind of light that it was, what they could tell from that kind of weather, what will happen in those physical circumstances. And he was marvellous at that kind of bridging conversation. And all through John's life, he knew a lot of painters from the era he was on, but he also knew a lot of writers, but he also just picked up people from all sorts of places that he had an empathy to. And, it was a two-way street. He was learning. He wasn't teaching them. But I think that I remember being up in Malay one time, And we went down to meet one of the Volks company, and this is the mark of my gullibility. We went up to the bar, and we all went up to the bar. And so I was first in, so I said, well, what we have? And I'm waiting to hear, I'll have a neat kind of park or something like that. But everybody drank these extraordinary things. I'll have a whiskey. I'll have some green pepper. And I thought, I mean, dearly, because everybody was drinking something so extraordinarily diluted in this way that it was my silly idea. These were hard sailors, you know, that they were out to sea and live with their lives on the dice edge and so on. And here they're drinking these incredibly effete cocktails. And of course John wasn't drinking at all, and so he's in the midst of all this. And you know, everybody starts to talk and slur away, and John doesn't pay any attention to that. He's just in there, he's part of the conversation, he's joking, he's taking their jokes. He was a great blender.
I'm actually from
Are you?
and I remember in the early 70s.
Right.
He was very regarded, sort of regarded as a mystery.
Yes.
But making it not really in village, but the laughter came, the sort of softness came, you know,
Right.
in the relationship.
Right.
But we created to be at last and found it, you know,
Yes.
the studio here. But I do remember it was early 70s, used to be a scene in the village hall of some of his works. And that's not wrong, really, that's 40 years ago.
Yeah.
I remember my father saying, there's Jon Schueler's paintings, £200 or £400. You know, look back and there's thousands of pounds now, but that was just seen as, what's his art about, you know.
Yeah.
But I know the skipper of the boat was actually already the manager, Jim Manson's his name.
Really?
A very good living man. Studying space myself from it in court. He was really listening to him on a spiritual level and trying to get into John's head about what he was trying to, you know. So it's a lovely film to see and try and make out Jon Schueler. It was a very interesting film.
When we had the exhibition when he had the big exhibition in the hall in Mallow, I should say that was actually put on by Highland Council because I was doing the job that these guys were doing at that time. That one worked right as well. And it was the local ladies who did the teas and cakes and everything else. And everybody was just sitting and chatting and really just in a really relaxed way. He said it was the most meaningful exhibition for him.
Yes, and it was welcomed and you know, it was quite different, as you say, from local fishermen. But there's a respect for Jon Schueler.
So do you know Hamish, who made his stretchers?
Hamish.
I don't know his surname.
Was it Hamish?
Smith.
Oh, yeah, Hamish.
You know Hamish, yeah.
You know the family there.
I mean, over the years, John does a marvellous revision. Hamish played over there, you all know, St. John Magdalene.
Yeah, Hamish was a broad mind as well. I don't appreciate that he was, you know, it was a very...
Yeah, lovely man. Oh, how nice that
Yeah. I've thoroughly enjoyed this sort of film and this. It's very interesting.
We're kind of coming to the end of our time. If there's any more questions, happy to.
That was your moment.
And that was your moment, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sure, I think this has been filmed. I'm sure Mike will be thrilled to hear someone from the lake was here with you.
Well, then I would just like to say thank you very much for your time and coming this way and talking to us. Thank you.